My mother-in-law stood up from her walker the moment she thought no one was looking. I wasn't supposed to see it. I wasn't supposed to notice the smile that disappeared the instant my husband turned back toward her. 5 minutes later, she looked him in the eye and whispered, "Before I die, I just want the truth to come out." Then she accused me of stealing from a dying woman. My husband never asked if it was true. He simply slid a stack of legal papers across the table and told me to sign. I reached for the pen anyway because hidden inside those papers was the first mistake she had made, and the only reason I knew I would eventually win. At that moment, everyone in the room believed I was surrendering. They had no idea I was waiting for one lie to become too many. The conference room felt strangely quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the rustle of expensive paper. My husband, Mark, couldn't bring himself to look directly at me. His eyes stayed fixed on the polished walnut table as though avoiding my face would somehow make this easier. Across from him sat his 81-year-old mother, Evelyn Bennett, wrapped in a pale gray cardigan with a blanket folded neatly across her lap. She looked fragile enough to break in half. Her hands trembled as she held a folder against her chest, and every few seconds she coughed softly into a white handkerchief. Anyone walking into that room would have seen a sick elderly widow searching for justice. They would have believed every word before she even spoke. I almost did myself, until I remembered what I had witnessed less than an hour earlier. When she arrived outside the law office, she stepped out of the SUV without assistance. She adjusted her jacket, smoothed her hair in the reflection of the passenger window, and walked several steady steps toward the entrance before glancing around the parking lot. The instant she spotted my husband's car turning the corner, everything changed. Her shoulders collapsed. Her pace slowed. The walker appeared from the back seat. By the time Mark reached her side, she looked like a woman who could barely remain standing. It lasted only a few seconds, but those few seconds changed everything I thought I knew. I said nothing because I needed to understand whether I had witnessed a moment of pride from an independent woman, or the opening scene of something much darker. Now, seated across from me with our family attorney quietly organizing documents, Evelyn dabbed her eyes and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Before my time runs out," she said, "I don't want to leave this world carrying secrets anymore." Mark finally lifted his head. His expression was full of concern, heartbreak, and absolute trust. He reached across the table and gently squeezed his mother's hand. I realized then that whatever story she was about to tell, he had already decided to believe it before hearing a single sentence. I folded my own hands together beneath the table to keep them perfectly still. I wasn't afraid of what Evelyn would say. I was afraid of how carefully she had prepared to say it. I signed exactly where Mark pointed, then slid the papers back across the table without saying a single word. Evelyn watched my hand instead of my face. That told me more than anything she had said so far. She was not looking for regret. She was looking for confirmation that her plan was working. Her shoulders relaxed almost immediately, and for the first time since I entered the room, I noticed the corner of her mouth lift ever so slightly before she remembered to look weak again. The attorney gathered the documents and thanked everyone for remaining calm. Mark finally spoke. He said he knew this had been difficult for all of us, but the family needed honesty before it was too late. I looked at him for several long seconds, wondering how the man who had spent 40 years beside me could now sound like a stranger repeating someone else's script. I wanted to ask him when he had stopped trusting me. Instead, I simply nodded. There would be time for questions later. Truth always arrived eventually. It simply moved slower than lies. As the meeting ended, Evelyn struggled to stand from her chair. Mark rushed to help her, wrapping one arm around her shoulders with the same gentle care he once reserved for me after my knee replacement surgery. She thanked him with watery eyes and leaned heavily against her walker while they slowly made their way toward the elevator. I remained behind for only a few moments, pretending to organize my purse while watching their reflection in the glass wall outside the conference room. The elevator doors opened. Mark stepped inside first. Evelyn glanced over both shoulders. Believing herself alone, she released the walker with one hand and reached comfortably into her oversized handbag to answer a telephone call. Her voice changed instantly. The weakness disappeared. Her words became crisp, confident, and almost cheerful. I could not hear everything through the glass, but I clearly heard her laugh. Then the elevator doors closed before I could make out another sentence. I walked outside several minutes later into the cool Ohio afternoon. The October air carried the scent of damp leaves after a light morning rain. Rachel was waiting across the street inside her blue SUV exactly where we had agreed. The moment I climbed into the passenger seat, she searched my face for answers. "Did you sign?" she asked quietly. I buckled my seatbelt before answering. "Yes," I said. Exactly as they expected. Rachel gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Mom, if Grandma is lying, why would you give her what she wants?" I looked back at the law office where Mark was carefully helping Evelyn into his car. From a distance they looked like a devoted son caring for his fragile mother. It was a picture anyone would admire. It was also a picture built on something that no longer felt real. Because, I answered, people who spend months creating a perfect story eventually believe they cannot make mistakes. That is when they stop hiding them. Rachel started the engine but did not pull away. She followed my gaze toward the parking lot. Just as Mark walked around to the driver's side, Evelyn folded her walker with surprising ease and placed it into the trunk herself before quickly looking around to make sure nobody had noticed. Rachel saw it too. Neither of us said another word as she slowly drove away, because at that exact moment we both realized we were no longer dealing with a misunderstanding. We were looking at a performance that had been rehearsed far longer than either of us had imagined. I spent that night in Rachel's guest room, staring at a ceiling I had painted with her more than 20 years earlier when she was expecting her first child. Sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the confidence on Evelyn's face when I signed those papers. It was not relief. It was satisfaction. There was a difference, and once I recognized it, I could not ignore it. Early the next morning, Rachel placed a cup of coffee beside me and quietly set her tablet on the kitchen table. "Mom," she said, "Grandma posted something last night." I opened the page and felt my stomach tighten. Evelyn had shared a photograph of herself wrapped in the same gray cardigan from the law office. Her caption thanked friends for their prayers and said she finally felt safe after years of emotional suffering. Hundreds of comments filled the screen. People I had known for decades called her brave. Some wrote that older adults deserved protection from greedy relatives. Others said they had always suspected something about me. I recognized neighbors, former church volunteers, even a woman who had attended my retirement party. Not one of them had called to ask if the story was true. Rachel reached for the tablet, ready to close it, but I gently stopped her. "Leave it open," I said. "Every lie leaves a footprint." She looked confused. "How can those comments help us?" I pointed to the timestamp beneath the photograph. The picture had supposedly been taken after the legal meeting, yet sunlight poured through the window behind Evelyn at an angle that did not match the cloudy afternoon we had just experienced. It looked brighter, almost like another day entirely. More importantly, the decorative pillow beside her caught my attention. I had purchased that exact pillow nearly 5 years earlier for a rental property Mark and I had owned on the east side of Columbus before selling it. I remembered it because it had an unusual blue stitching pattern that I had chosen myself. "That room is not her bedroom," I whispered. Rachel leaned closer. "Are you sure?" "I bought that pillow." She enlarged the image. There, partially hidden behind the arm of Evelyn's chair, sat an old ceramic lamp with a tiny chip near its base. I remembered wrapping that lamp in newspaper when we emptied the rental house. Mark had insisted his mother keep several pieces of furniture after the sale because she said she might need them someday. Rachel slowly lowered the tablet. "You think she took the picture somewhere else?" I nodded. "Not somewhere else. Somewhere she already prepared." The thought settled over the room like heavy fog. This was no longer a spontaneous accusation fueled by hurt feelings. Whoever arranged that photograph had carefully selected furniture, lighting, clothing, and timing. That required planning. Rachel immediately opened a map application and searched the address of the old duplex. According to county records, the property had been purchased by an investment company nearly 2 years earlier, but public listings showed it remained vacant while awaiting renovations. She looked at me with cautious determination. "If nobody lives there, would anyone notice if we drove by?" I looked out the kitchen window at the quiet suburban street where children waited for their school buses and neighbors walked their dogs as though the world remained perfectly ordinary. Then I looked back at the photograph glowing on the screen. "Let us find out," I said, because for the first time since Evelyn accused me, I was no longer searching for a way to defend myself. I was searching for the place where her story had been built. Rachel drove slowly through the east side of Columbus, while I kept the photograph open on my tablet. Every turn looked more familiar than the last. We had owned the duplex for almost 12 years before selling it after my retirement, and I could still remember planting the small maple tree beside the front walkway. When it finally came into view, the tree was taller, but everything else looked strangely frozen in time. The windows were covered from the inside, and a temporary construction sign leaned crookedly against the porch, yet there were no workers, no equipment, and no vehicles nearby. Rachel parked half a block away. "If this is just an empty building," she whispered, "we leave. We are not here to cause trouble." I agreed. We walked along the sidewalk as though we were simply enjoying the cool autumn afternoon. From the street, the house looked abandoned. Paint peeled from the porch railing, and dry leaves collected in the corners of the steps. But something felt wrong. The front doormat looked almost new. Someone had recently swept the porch clean. There were no spider webs across the doorway, even though neighboring houses had plenty. I circled toward the side yard where a narrow gravel driveway led to the back. Rachel suddenly touched my arm and pointed toward a trash bin waiting beside the garage. Sitting on top was an empty cosmetics box labeled as professional theatrical makeup, designed to create realistic bruises and skin discoloration for stage performances. I stared at it without speaking. A chill ran through me despite the mild weather. Rachel quietly photographed the box before placing it exactly where she had found it. We continued toward the rear of the property. One basement window lacked a curtain, leaving just enough space to see inside. The room was mostly empty except for a folding chair, several bright photography lights, a rolling clothing rack, and stacked storage bins. Nothing about it resembled a family home. It looked more like a temporary studio assembled for one specific purpose. Then my eyes settled on the corner of the room. Folded neatly against the wall was the same silver walker Evelyn had carried into the attorney's office. Beside it rested the gray cardigan from her social media photograph. Rachel slowly raised her phone again, taking pictures through the glass without touching anything. My heartbeat grew heavier with every second. The room confirmed what we had feared, but it also raised a more dangerous question. If someone had created an entire set for those photographs, who else had helped? As we turned to leave, I noticed a large envelope partially sticking out beneath a plastic storage container near the window. Only one corner was visible, but it was enough for me to recognize the logo printed across the top. It belonged to Daniel Brooks, the same attorney who had supervised the papers I signed the day before. Rachel followed my gaze. "Mom," she whispered, "why would Grandma have legal documents here instead of at her house?" I did not answer because I did not have one. Instead, I memorized every detail I could see through the glass. The lights, the clothing, the walker, the envelope. Nothing belonged in an abandoned duplex, unless someone intended to return. We walked back to the SUV without saying another word until Rachel finally broke the silence. "She did not just prepare a story," she said quietly. "She built a stage for it." I looked back once more at the silent house disappearing behind us and realized that whatever waited inside that envelope might explain why Evelyn had been so desperate for everyone to believe her before anyone started asking questions. Rachel did not start the engine right away. She sat quietly with both hands resting on the steering wheel, while the photographs remained open on her phone. Neither of us wanted to speak too quickly and risk reaching the wrong conclusion. Evidence mattered more than suspicion. That lesson had guided my entire career, and now it might be the only thing capable of saving my family. We drove to a small coffee shop several miles away before reviewing every picture one by one. The silver walker was unmistakable. The gray cardigan matched the one Evelyn had worn in the attorney's office. The photography lights explained why every image she posted online looked carefully staged instead of naturally captured. Then Rachel enlarged the photograph showing the envelope beneath the storage container. We still could not read everything printed across the front, but the return address clearly belonged to Daniel Brooks's law office. "There has to be a reason those papers were hidden there," Rachel said. "Nobody stores legal documents in an empty duplex, unless they do not want someone else to find them." I agreed, but another question bothered me even more. If Daniel Brooks had prepared those documents, did he know where they had ended up? Or had someone moved them without his knowledge? I refused to accuse an attorney without proof. We needed facts, not assumptions. On the drive back to Rachel's house, I remembered something I had nearly forgotten. 2 months earlier, Mark had mentioned that his mother was asking unusual questions about the family trust. At the time I assumed she simply wanted to understand how everything would eventually be handled. Now those conversations sounded very different. After dinner, I opened the locked file cabinet where I had always kept copies of our financial records. Most of the documents were digital now, but I still believed in keeping paper copies of anything important. I searched through tax returns, insurance policies, property records, and estate planning files until I found the original trust paperwork. Rachel sat beside me comparing dates while I turned each page carefully. Then she stopped me. "Mom, look at this." She pointed to a clause explaining that if major marital disputes resulted in certain financial claims, ownership interests could be transferred into a separate protective trust under specific legal conditions. It was a complicated provision that had never seemed important before. Now it felt like the missing piece of a puzzle. If someone convinced Mark that I committed financial misconduct, I said slowly, he could be pressured into restructuring assets before asking enough questions. Rachel looked up from the paperwork with growing concern. That would explain why everything happened so fast. The accusations, the legal meeting, the pressure to sign. Nobody wanted time. They wanted urgency. I nodded. Suddenly Evelyn's performance made perfect sense. A woman who appeared gravely ill created emotional pressure. A frightened son stopped thinking like a husband and started reacting like a child desperate to protect his mother. Every decision became immediate because everyone believed there might not be another chance. The illness was not the real objective. It was the clock. Late that evening my telephone rang. Daniel Brooks's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice remained calm and professional. He said there were several additional documents requiring signatures later that week and asked whether I would be available. I thanked him politely and said I would be there. After we ended the call, I placed the phone on the table and looked at Rachel. "She believes I am still following her plan," I said quietly. Rachel smiled for the first time in days. "Then let her believe it a little longer." I folded the trust documents, returned them to the cabinet, and realized that I was no longer trying to prove I was innocent. I was preparing for the moment when Evelyn would unknowingly explain her own plan in front of everyone who had believed her. The next morning I called Daniel Brooks before anyone else could reach me. I kept my voice calm and almost apologetic. I told him I had spent the night thinking about everything that had happened, and that I did not want a long legal battle. He thanked me for being reasonable, and explained that one final meeting would allow everyone to settle the remaining paperwork. I asked whether Evelyn would be there. He hesitated for only a second before saying she insisted on attending. That single pause told me more than his answer. Someone wanted Evelyn in the room for every important decision. After ending the call, I turned to Rachel. "We are not changing their plans," I said. "We are letting them believe every step is still under their control." Rachel nodded but looked uneasy. "What if they are expecting questions?" I smiled gently. "Then we will disappoint them." The rest of the day became an exercise in patience. I answered Mark's text messages with only a few polite sentences. He wrote that he hoped we could resolve everything respectfully. He never apologized. He never asked how I was doing. He simply spoke about paperwork, schedules, and what he believed was best for everyone involved. I realized he was still living inside the story Evelyn had created. Arguing with him now would only make him defend that story even harder. Late that afternoon I gathered every document Rachel and I had collected. The photographs from the duplex. Copies of Evelyn's social media posts. The original trust agreement. Printed county property records showing the abandoned duplex had remained vacant for months. I placed everything into a plain folder with no labels. It looked ordinary, and that was exactly how I wanted it to appear. The strongest evidence rarely announced itself. That evening Rachel received an unexpected telephone call from her cousin Emily. She sounded uncomfortable as she explained that Evelyn had been calling relatives all week, telling everyone she finally felt safe because the family was standing together. She also mentioned that another family meeting would permanently resolve the financial issues before Evelyn's health became worse. Rachel thanked her without revealing anything. After hanging up, she looked at me. She is building an audience, she said quietly. She wants everyone to believe the ending before it actually happens. I nodded. Which means she has become confident enough to stop being careful. The following afternoon I arrived at Daniel Brooks's office 15 minutes early. I wore the same navy blue blazer I had worn during my retirement celebration years before. I wanted to remind myself who I had been long before this family crisis began. Daniel greeted me professionally and escorted me into the conference room. While he organized files, I studied the table. There were more folders than before. More signature tabs. More carefully arranged stacks of paper. Everything suggested that significant decisions would be made that day. A few minutes later, I heard familiar footsteps in the hallway. Mark entered first, carrying Evelyn's handbag while she followed behind him with her walker moving slowly across the polished floor. She looked exhausted, but I noticed something else. She was smiling before she reached the doorway. The smile disappeared the instant she saw me looking directly at her. She lowered her eyes, tightened her grip on the walker, and resumed the role everyone expected. I offered a polite greeting. She answered with a faint, trembling voice. Then Daniel closed the conference room door, placed the final folder in the center of the table, and said there was one last matter that needed to be confirmed before anyone signed another page. I watched Evelyn lean forward with complete confidence, unaware that every answer she was about to give would matter far more than any signature waiting inside those folders. Daniel Brooks folded his hands on the conference table and spoke with the same calm voice he had used during every meeting I had attended over the years. He explained that before any additional legal documents could be finalized, he needed to verify several factual statements that formed the basis for the proposed changes to the family trust. He apologized for the formality and said it was simply part of his responsibility. Evelyn smiled gently and assured him she understood completely. She looked almost relieved to have another opportunity to tell her story. Daniel began with simple questions. He asked her to confirm the date she claimed I first prevented her from accessing her personal bank account. She answered without hesitation. Then he asked where she had been living when those events supposedly occurred. Again she answered confidently, describing the bedroom where she claimed she had spent most of her time recovering from illness. I remained completely silent. Mark listened carefully, occasionally nodding as though hearing these details for the first time. Daniel continued. He asked which physician had diagnosed her condition, how frequently she attended appointments, and when she first believed her health had declined. Evelyn answered every question smoothly, never stopping to think. She had rehearsed this story so many times that it flowed almost effortlessly. That was exactly what worried me. People telling the truth often paused to remember. People repeating a script rarely needed to. Daniel then reached for another folder. Mrs. Bennett, he said politely, for the record, could you also confirm that the photographs you provided accurately represent the room where you have been living during this period? Evelyn smiled sadly and nodded. Every one of them, she replied. Those photographs show exactly how I have been living. Daniel thanked her and made another note. Across the table I noticed Rachel sitting quietly beside me, saying nothing, revealing nothing. She had promised we would let Evelyn keep talking, and she honored that promise perfectly. Daniel turned another page. One final clarification, he continued. You previously stated that Mrs. Laura Bennett isolated you from your family and controlled your daily activities. Is that still your testimony today? Evelyn looked directly at Mark before answering. Yes, she said softly. I prayed every day that someone would finally believe me. Mark lowered his eyes. His expression carried guilt, sympathy, and determination all at once. I could almost see him trying to reconcile the woman he had trusted his entire life with the wife who had shared 40 years beside him. Daniel remained composed. He thanked Evelyn once more before reaching for a small digital recorder resting near his notebook. I appreciate your patience, he said. Because these statements may affect future legal decisions, I wanted to ensure your testimony was complete and accurately preserved. Evelyn nodded without concern. She believed the recording protected her version of events. She did not realize it also preserved every inconsistency she had just committed herself to. Daniel closed the recorder and carefully arranged 3 separate folders side by side on the polished table. None of them had been opened yet. He rested one hand lightly on the first folder before looking around the room. Now, he said quietly, there are several additional documents and supporting materials that everyone should review together before we proceed any further. I finally lifted my eyes to meet Evelyn's. For the first time since this ordeal began, I saw uncertainty flicker across her face. It lasted only a heartbeat before she forced another tired smile, but it was enough. Somewhere beneath all of her careful preparation, she had begun to sense that the meeting was no longer following the script she believed she had written. Daniel slowly opened the first folder and removed several color photographs. Without saying a word, he placed them one by one across the conference table until every person in the room could see them clearly. Mark leaned forward first. His expression changed almost immediately. The photograph showed the inside of the abandoned duplex Rachel and I had visited only 2 days earlier. There was the silver walker resting against the wall. There was the gray cardigan folded neatly across a chair. There were the professional lighting stands positioned toward an empty corner where a comfortable armchair had recently been removed. Daniel allowed the silence to linger before speaking again. "Mrs. Bennett," he asked gently, "would you please explain why these items appear inside a vacant property that is not your residence?" Evelyn looked down for only a second before answering. She said she had stored old belongings there years ago and had simply forgotten about them. It sounded believable at first, until Daniel reached into the second folder. This time he removed printed copies of the social media photographs Evelyn had shared with friends and family. He carefully placed them beside the photographs from the duplex. The similarities became impossible to ignore. The same cardigan, the same decorative pillow, the same ceramic lamp with the chipped base. Even the shadows cast by the lighting fell at identical angles. Mark stared at the pages without saying a word. Rachel quietly slid one additional photograph toward the center of the table. It showed the unopened cosmetics package we had found beside the trash container outside the duplex. Daniel nodded toward it. "Professional theatrical makeup," he said calmly. "Designed to create temporary skin discoloration for stage and camera productions." Evelyn immediately shook her head and insisted she had never seen the package before. Daniel did not argue. Instead, he opened the final folder. Inside were certified county property records confirming the duplex had remained vacant for many months, along with maintenance reports showing no authorized tenant had occupied the building during that time. He placed one final document on top of the stack. It was a delivery receipt listing photography equipment shipped to that same address only 3 weeks earlier. The purchaser's name had been partially hidden for privacy, but the billing address matched Evelyn's residence. For the first time since the meeting began, she did not answer immediately. Mark slowly turned toward his mother. "Mom," he said quietly, "why would photography equipment be delivered to an empty house?" Evelyn looked from him to Daniel, then to me, as though searching for someone willing to rescue her from the question. No one spoke. The silence itself became an answer. Then Daniel calmly continued, "There is one more matter that concerns me even more than these photographs." He reached beneath the remaining papers and lifted a sealed envelope bearing his own law office letterhead. This envelope was prepared in connection with proposed revisions to the Bennett Family Trust, he explained. "It should never have been outside my office without my authorization." I watched Evelyn's fingers tighten around the edge of the conference table. The confidence that had carried her through every accusation was beginning to disappear. Mark noticed it too. His voice became almost unrecognizable as he asked the question that should have been asked from the very beginning. "Mother," he said softly, "what exactly have you been trying to do?" Evelyn opened her mouth to answer, but before a single word could leave her lips, Daniel carefully unfolded the documents from inside the envelope and said there was one signature among them that every person in the room needed to examine very closely. Daniel placed the document in front of Mark without saying another word. My husband stared at the signature for several long seconds before looking back at his mother. "This is my name," he said quietly. "But I never signed this." Daniel nodded. He explained that the document authorized major financial changes involving the family trust, and that the signature appeared inconsistent with other verified samples already on file. He emphasized that no final conclusions had been reached, But the differences were significant enough to require an independent examination before any legal action could continue. The room fell completely silent. Evelyn finally spoke, insisting there had to be some mistake, perhaps an old draft or an administrative error. Her voice no longer carried the confidence it had only minutes earlier. It carried uncertainty. Daniel calmly slid another document across the table. It showed a timeline of communications requesting urgent revisions to the trust. Every request had arrived shortly after new claims about my behavior had been presented to Mark. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Each accusation had created pressure. Each moment of pressure had been followed by another request to move assets more quickly. Mark slowly leaned back in his chair and covered his face with both hands. "You kept telling me there was no time," he whispered. "You said we had to act before it was too late." Evelyn reached toward him, but he gently moved his chair farther away. It was the first time since this began that he had stepped back instead of stepping closer. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired. 40 years of marriage had taught me that trust was not destroyed in one dramatic moment. It disappeared through a long series of choices. Mark looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Laura," he said softly, "why did you sign the papers if you already suspected something?" I answered honestly, "Because if I had argued, everyone would have remembered the argument. I needed everyone to remember the evidence instead." Daniel carefully gathered the disputed documents and explained that no further changes to the trust or marital assets would proceed until every record had been independently reviewed. He also confirmed that all future discussions would be postponed while the documentation was verified through the proper legal process. Rachel quietly reached over and squeezed my hand beneath the table. She had believed me when almost nobody else did, and I would never forget that. Evelyn remained seated without speaking. For the first time since I had known her, she had no prepared story left to tell. The performance had ended because facts required no applause. As we stood to leave, Mark stopped beside me. He apologized without asking for immediate forgiveness. He admitted that he had allowed fear to replace judgment and emotion to replace trust. I thanked him for telling the truth, but I also told him that rebuilding a marriage required more than recognizing a mistake. It required living differently every day afterward. Outside the law office, the autumn air felt lighter than it had in weeks. Rachel smiled as we walked toward her vehicle. I looked back only once. Evelyn remained inside the conference room, no longer surrounded by certainty, only by the consequences of decisions she had believed nobody would ever question. I finally understood that winning was never about proving someone else wrong. It was about refusing to surrender my integrity even when the people closest to me doubted it. The truth had taken longer to arrive than the lies, but when it finally entered the room, it did not need to raise its voice because every piece of evidence spoke clearly enough on its own.